In 2006, a rare print by Edward Steichen came up for auction at Sotheby's. This print, called The Pond of Moonlight, was one of only 3 prints of this captivating photograph to exist. What makes it even more rare and unique is that Edward Steichen hand-coloured all of these images, so there's subtle variations in each one. As a hush descended upon the room, the auctioneer started the bidding and history was being made. Up and up the figure crept until finally the hammer came down for $2.9 million, which at the time was the highest price ever paid for a photograph. This interest in Edward Steichen's photography, which had been created over a century before, just goes to show how in demand and influential he remains even today in the 21st century. Edward Steichen's career has reached unrivaled heights. Throughout his life, there was hardly a photographic genre which Steichen had not turned his unquestionable talent towards. Throughout photography, his legacy is everywhere. Edward Steichen helped to found the photo secession with Alfred Stieglitz. He was credited with creating some of the first modern fashion photography, along with his captivating portraits for Vanity Fair, which defined the look of the 1920s. There was also the worldwide sensation, the Family of Man exhibition, which he helped create and was seen by over 9 million people around the world. He was also instrumental in promoting the emergence of a new and vibrant breed of photographers in the 1950s and 60s as the director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. In all of photography, there is barely a corner that hasn't felt Edward Steichen's influence. Thank you for joining me here today as we look at Edward Steichen, one of the greatest and most influential photographers to have ever lived. When Edward Steichen was 21, he was traveling to Paris to go and study painting, and he was on his way through New York. He had a letter of introduction to Alfred Stieglitz, who was at the time kind of like the tastemaker of American photography. Steichen was aware of Stieglitz's work, and in fact, he'd actually had some prints exhibited next to Stieglitz in an exhibition. Stieglitz was so taken with the young Edward Steichen's photography that he actually bought 3 of the prints for $5 each. Now, considering at the time the most that Edward Steichen had actually sold any photographs for was 50 cents, you can imagine how thrilled he was at the prospect of this, especially from a photographer who was as respected as Alfred Stieglitz. So he left his prints and his folio with Stieglitz and popped on the boat to go over to France. Steichen was spending more time developing his photographic skills along with his painting skills. Steichen was exceptionally fortunate that he was able to hang out with a number of great artists like Henri Matisse, Rodin, and various other major figures in the art scene. Back in the United States, Alfred Stieglitz was creating the photo secession and invited Edward Steichen to become a founder member. If you're not familiar with the photo secession, I will go into more depth about it later on in a different video for you. What's important to know about the photo secession is, and pictorialism in general, is that they were looking to bring a painterly quality to their images, and they achieved this through various means like spitting on the lens, kicking around the tripod so they get a bit of a blurry, sort of almost abstract sort of feel to the photograph, and also using color, and which at the time meant using to have a gum bichromate process, which is when you put light sensitive dyes physically into the print itself, which is why you end up with these subtle variations between various prints of the same image. I'm a big fan of the pictorialist feel of photographs, to have this organic type of quality to them that I find is somewhat lacking in today's digital photography. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below if you like the pictorialist feel or if you prefer sort of the cleaner digital look of today's images. Edward Steichen at the time was creating numerous portraits and landscapes, but possibly his most famous photograph from this period is the Flatiron Building. I don't think there's anybody who has had a passing interest in photography or the history of photography who has not seen this print at some point. Edward Steichen's influences in this photograph of the Flatiron Building can be seen quite clearly. You have Whistler and his tonalist style. This is all the sort of the coloring coming in, along with the Japanese influences that were quite popular at the time in France. That's the tree branch leaning into the frame from the outside. At the time, the building was one of the tallest in the world, and one of the things that you notice within this photograph is that the top of the building has been chopped off, and that's almost as if Steichen is sort of looking to say the building is so big that it cannot be contained by the frame of the photograph. Edward Steichen served as an aerial photographer during World War I, and prior to this he had done some fashion photography with a pictorialist feel. But it was after his experiences during the war with photographing the scarred battlefields that he started to move more towards a straight photography in his fashion portraits. It was around this time that he was hired by Condé Nast for the extravagant figure of $35,000 a year to take photographs for them, which in today's money is the equivalent of $500,000. Edward Steichen has famously said that a photograph isn't made in the camera, but on either side of it. And one of the best illustrations of this is a story that Edward Steichen himself shares about his experience of photographing Greta Garbo.
Garbo came in off the set. The director says, "Now you have only 5 minutes." I said, "All right." So I had a kitchen chair there for her to sit on. I draped my black frequency cloth over the back. I asked her to sit on that chair. She sat on the chair, and like a good sport, she straddled the chair, leaned her arm on the back facing me. And then I started the photograph, and she would turn her head this way and shake her head in this way. And this wasn't the Garbo that I was interested in. This was the regular Hollywood Garbo. So I said, "It's too bad we have to photograph all these things with the hairdo that you wear in the thing, this Hollywood hairdo." She said, "Oh, this hair," put her hand up to her head and brushed them back. And I said, "Greta, now let's make a photograph of that." And the good sport again that she was, she went into it, and those are the only pictures I have ever used of Greta Garbo.
I really hope that you're enjoying this look at the life of Edward Steichen. If you are, please give the video a thumbs up, because that way YouTube will know to promote the video to other people like yourself who would find this kind of content interesting. At the end of the video, I'm going to put up a playlist of all the other episodes I've done looking at the lives of the great photographers throughout the years. You can see over the 15 years or so between Steichen's involvement with the photo secessionists and his time on Condé Nast and setting almost a tone for the 1920s, that he's gone from this pictorialist feel of very much looking like he's an artist or a painter with a camera to this extremely straight photographic sense where it got strong compositional elements within the frames, sort of isolating the subjects, and his intriguing use of light, which of course comes from his artistic and painterly backgrounds. This idea of isolating the subject within the frame with composition elements is really, it still feels fresh and modern to this day. And it's interesting to look through photographs that have come on since and see Edward Steichen's influence tracing through them almost like a vein. Irving Penn's famous corner photographs are a good example of this. You can sort of see how the set itself is acting as a framing device. And of course, into the modern day as well, we have Zack Snyder's photographs of Jared Leto as the Joker that were recently released. Commercial photography was extremely lucrative for Steichen, and his third wife recorded in her biography of him that as his fees increased and rose, so did the demand for his photography. He turned his hand to pretty much anything that came along. Still life, portraiture, architectural photography, even so far as to create photographs for a children's illustrated book. By the late 1930s, Edward Steichen had all but retired to a quiet life of raising prize-winning flowers. However, on the horizon, the clouds of war were gathering again. In 1942, Edward Steichen was invited by the US Navy to become the director of their photographic unit to cover the war in the Pacific. Steichen was also responsible for directing a documentary film about a US Navy aircraft carrier called the Fighting Lady. In 1945, this documentary won an Oscar. So the only film that Edward Steichen ever directed, he got an Oscar for Best Picture, or Best Documentary Picture. So, you know, another notch in his bedpost. As part of his duties with the US Navy, he was responsible for curating two, well, I suppose we could call them propaganda exhibitions to help promote the war effort. And these were made in conjunction with the Museum of Modern Art. And this is how he was drawn to their attention and was ultimately offered the position of Director of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. In retrospect, we tend to think that all of these things were just happy events in people's lives because all these photographers are so great today. But one particular photographer, Ansel Adams, was a little bit catty about it, and he wrote a letter saying that Edward Steichen's appointment was, and I can't believe he actually said this, a body blow to the progress of creative photography, which seems, just in retrospect, a little bit catty. You know, you can almost hear the wow sort of coming through over the generations. During Edward Steichen's tenure at the museum, he was instrumental in kickstarting the careers of this up-and-coming generation of photographers. You know, he championed Robert Frank before Robert Frank had released The Americans. He was interested in displaying Harry Callahan's photographs, and he authorized the purchase of some early Gary Winogrand prints with the memo that says, dangerously close to snapshots, but have a collective impact. Maybe show, group and show, and buy 3 at $10 each. A delightful story of his period with the Museum of Modern Art was when a 14-year-old boy had the audacity to write to the great Edward Steichen requesting permission to show him some of his photographs. Now, Edward Steichen was intrigued by this young man's chutzpah, so he agreed, and this guy came along and showed him his portfolio. And Edward Steichen was so taken by the photographs this young photographer was sharing with him that he bought 3 for the museum. And this is how the career of Stephen Shaw, one of the most influential photographers of his generation, was started. Following Edward Steichen's experiences during the Second World War with those 2 exhibitions that he put together for the Navy, there was an idea formulating in his mind which would ultimately become known as the touring exhibition called The Family of Man.
I had a feeling, or a hope rather, that if people really saw what war was like in all its bestiality and brutality, that might be a deterrent, that the people would rise. People came to the exhibition, thought they were very interesting. Sometimes you'd see somebody with a tear in their eye, but everybody walked out and completely forgot all about it. And the reason for this suddenly struck me, that was approaching the idea from a negative standpoint. And from a negative standpoint, nothing ever does any good. So thinking about it, I said, now, switching from the positive standpoint, I ought to show what a wonderful thing life is, and how human beings all over the world are alike. This then resulted in the Family of Man exhibition.
The exhibition was a huge success, and it was seen by over 9 million people during its initial run, and ended up on permanent display in Luxembourg, which is Edward Steichen's home country. Edward Steichen regarded The Family of Man as the culmination of his career, and in 1961 he resigned his position at the Museum of Modern Art and went to go and live a quiet life on his farm. As if coming full circle to the pond moonlight, in his twilight years, Edward Steichen was once more drawn to nature and to photograph it in all its glory. His attentions focused on a tiny shadlow tree on his property in Connecticut.
Began photographing this tree about 6 or 7 years ago. It's a symbol, that tree, of everything that exists in nature. And I look upon it almost as a human being, as a little girl. Cold day, isn't it, little girl, huh? Yes, that's all right. It won't be long now. The weather will get warm and you will bloom out again.
Edward Steichen died just a few days before his 94th birthday. This look at the life of Edward Steichen is just one in a series of episodes that I've created about the great photographers throughout history. I put a playlist up on screen right now so you can go and check out some of the other fantastic videos. Thanks ever so much for being here today, and I'll see you again soon.